Welcome to Austin on the Air, candid conversations about air filtration and air quality and the impact it has on children and adults at school, work, and home.
Welcome everyone to our Wildfire chat today. We are going to talk about the blanketing of wildfire smoke that we're now experiencing in the eastern United States. We are going to talk about what is in wildfire smoke anyway, how far does it travel, what are the health effects, and for how long, and then finally we're going to leave you with solutions. There are some really good solutions, and our top solution you should have in your home right now because wildfire smoke is coming to you. So I am here with Dr. Lyn Patrick, an environmental medicine global expert, and Stacy Mal from Austin Air, who is a air filtration specialist. So let's begin, Dr. Patrick, with what is in the wildfire smoke anyway?
So we think of smoke as just, a bunch of cinders, ashes, but that's not actually what's in wildfire smoke. And I want to add in building smoke because for so many of the wildfires that we've been dealing with, especially on the West Coast, it's not just trees that are burning, it's actual homes and buildings that are burning. And that adds a whole new toxic picture to what we call wildfire smoke exposure. So I'll be adding that in. So the first thing is that it's important to know, especially if you live in California, that as a result of the historic mining that happened in California, there's a significantly increased level of mercury in the trees in California. So yes, I know this sounds like tinfoil hat stuff, but trees absorb mercury from the atmosphere, especially coniferous trees. And as a result, when those trees are burned, there's atmospheric mercury that is released, right? So there have been some really good studies in California as well as in the boreal forests of Canada and northwestern United States, looking at the actual amounts of mercury that are released during wildfires that become atmospheric and can travel for a while. And we can absorb that mercury, that inorganic mercury, into our lungs from the air if we're exposed to wildfire smoke. So this is just one of the many reasons that we want to avoid that smoke as much as possible. We'll talk about how to do that later on. So other metals like lead and iron specifically result from wildfires, as well as arsenic and cadmium and many other metals. So those metals can be burned literally and can become airborne and can move as part of the wildfire smoke plume. As well, pesticides are part of the wildfire smoke exposome. So are solvents. And when we get more into buildings burning, when a building burns, the polyvinyl chloride pipe also burns, right? And so we get substances called dioxins, which are highly toxic substances. They were part of the East Palestine train derailment, combustion, exposure from the East Palestine burning of the vinyl chloride and the polyvinyl chloride. So the tricky part about wildfire smoke exposure is that the little carbon particle that we would call soot or cinder is got like a charge on it, an electrical charge that almost acts like Velcro for solvents and pesticides and metals. And so these little microscopic particles actually become like magnets for other air pollutants that will cling to them and allow the smoke plume to move for thousands of miles. We know, tracking the Canadian fires, that those smoke plumes have gone thousands of miles. They've actually been detected in European countries. And so it's not just a matter of are we on the West Coast or on the East Coast, but when fires happen, there is almost a global exposure to these plumes. So that's the kind of a short explanation of what's actually in wildfire smoke.
Yes, and I'd also like to add here that according to the World Health Organization, less than 1% of the global landmass meets their standards on PM 2.5 pollution, which is one of the particles that you will find predominantly in the wildfire smoke. So this really is a global problem. Even in the absence of a wildfire, we do have a problem with air pollution, killing 10 million people every year, according to the World Health Organization. So let's talk about a little bit more. How far do they travel? As Dr. Patrick mentioned, it travels hundreds to thousands of miles. It crosses continents. There was a big fire in Australia in 2019, and they found evidence of the particular elements in that smoke. They found it in South America subsequent to that. And so we know that these particles, and we can identify them from where they come from. They travel, they jump continents, they jump oceans, and they linger. You don't just have to be exposed. You don't just look out your window and maybe see a hazy day and go, oh, I guess today I'm exposed to some wildfire smoke. It's something to always be cognizant of. One of the ways you can check in today in your area what your PM 2.5 is you can go to a website called airnow.gov. It's an EPA website. You can put in your zip code and you will see what your PM 2.5 reading is for that day. And that can be very helpful in alerting you to your particular air quality. So that's how far wildfire smoke travels. And now let's go back to Dr. Patrick on the health risks of wildfire smoke.
So we think about wildfire smoke as something that affects the lungs, which is absolutely accurate. And any respiratory condition, everything from COPD to asthma and allergies are definitely exacerbated, made worse by wildfire smoke. But there's another area of health that we know from many, many clinical studies is very strongly affected by wildfire smoke, and that's cardiovascular disease. So every aspect of the effect on the blood vessels and the heart is made worse by wildfire smoke. So that would include heart arrhythmias, so irregular heartbeats, peripheral vascular disease, so damage to the blood vessels in the hands, the feet, the legs, and the arms, even cognitive problems that are related to heart disease, cerebrovascular disease. So that would be the effects of a stroke, long-term effects of a stroke. And the reason that wildfire smoke is so harmful to people who have any kind of heart condition is that we're dealing with very, very small particles. So we measure them, as Dr. Fine mentioned, by their size. So that 2.5 micron, 2.5 particle size is kind of a common way to measure air smoke particles. But there are particles that are even smaller. We call them ultrafine particles. There are particles that are many, many times more microscopic, and those are called nanoparticles. So all of these particles go not just into the lungs when we breathe them in, but into the blood vessels and throughout the body. So they can end up pretty much in any tissue of the body, including the heart and including the brain. And so there actually have been good studies looking at the presence of these particles in newborns, in infants, in children, and in young adults as well as adults. And these have been both studies that have been done after death, so being able to do brain biopsies on autopsies, as well as looking at the effect of these smoke particles on what's called heart rate variability, or how the heart is actually functioning, regulated by the nervous system. So it's clear that not just at the moment of exposure, but for many, many months after exposure, the cardiovascular system is affected. The other part, and I did mention it, of the effect of wildfire smoke is on cognition, on the brain, on brain health. And patients who have cognitive problems, and I'm talking about a multitude of cognitive problems, not just Alzheimer's disease, but any type of dementia and cognitive decline. You know, as we get older, sometimes our capacity, our brain's capacity to function starts to decline, the exposure to wildfire smoke will make that worse. And so again, these are just examples of exposures that, whether they happen at that moment or you're watching someone for months, and there's actually an ongoing study in Montana looking at years after wildfire smoke exposure, respiratory capacity continues to decrease even though the fires have been over for many years. We're seeing that the damage from wildfire smoke is not just temporary. It is permanent. Why? Because we're getting these nanoparticles and these ultrafine particles in our circulatory system, and they're ending up lodging in our bodies, right? And they don't just leave by themselves. They will stay there. So, there are a lot of other conditions I could go into. I think that when we're talking about chronic complex illness, like chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic Lyme disease or mold exposure related conditions, these are conditions related to chronic inflammation. And wildfire smoke will also make that chronic inflammation worse. It will drive that inflammation up. And so we're really wanting to focus here on ways to avoid exposure in the first place.
So let's talk about solutions. Don't worry, we've got solutions for you. And first and foremost is everybody really needs to have a good portable air filtration system in their home. We'll talk a little bit more about other therapeutics after, but we have Stacy here, and she's going to talk to us about Austin Air, which is a company that produces an air filtration system, and they actually do research. They do clinical studies on their air filters, and she's going to talk to us about that. So Stacy.
Thank you. Yes. So, you've mentioned the components that are within wildfire smoke. So we're not just talking about particulate matter too. And so when we think about air purification, we think about removing these pollutants and these toxins. It's important to look at the type of filtration, and the EPA has done a lot of research, the CDC, the World Health Organization. But the one that I find most interesting is the study that was done by the EPA, and they tested 100 different air filtration technologies. And what they found that was the most effective filtration technology was the combination of HEPA and activated carbon. And I think this is especially crucial when we're talking about wildfire smoke, because really when you're trying to get out a lot of these VOCs, these gases, and these chemicals, it really comes down to carbon as well, because the carbon is what's going to adsorb a lot of these harmful things. And then you have to look at, what amount of carbon are you using? Sometimes you'll see purifiers that have like a carbon screen with them, and it might be like 2.2 pounds of carbon right in that screen. When we're talking about wildfire smoke, these plumes, these clouds, it's a substantial amount of smoke. It's a substantial amount of pollution. And so there needs to be an adequate amount of filtration to be able to continually pull that out of the air. What you don't want is to get into a situation where you have a unit that has the filtration technology. It might have a little bit of carbon and some HEPA, but you're going to have to change those filters out regularly because they're going to get full more frequently. And so, as Anne Marie mentioned, we have done a lot of work, a lot of research. We've participated with organizations such as Johns Hopkins University, American Academy of Pediatrics, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, to do a lot of clinical trials on our units. So I think that's important too. We were also used by Battelle Laboratories, so the American government tested a lot of different, I think it was more than 100 air purifiers, and found ours to be the most efficient. So when we're looking at the filtration, we have to look at the type and the amount. in regards to the clinical trials, one specifically that we did with Johns Hopkins University, originally it looked at people with COPD and the air quality in their homes. Austin air filters were provided to these people, and it was very promising. They showed a decrease in symptoms. What happened though is, as we know, people with COPD tend to have cardiac issues as well. And so the second kind of part of that study was to look at how it might continue to improve in other ways, not just their COPD symptoms. And this was actually the first US study that kind of looked at that association, between household PM and cardiac autonomic function. And what we found was that people with COPD that had these issues, there was improvement. And so I think, and I can give you the link to that study that you can read about it. But I think when we're talking about, as you mentioned, Lyn, that it's not just respiratory here when we're talking about wildfire smoke. And so I think this is important to look at, okay, if you're going to try and remove these pollutants that are causing these symptoms or this damage, this permanent damage, it has to be the filtration technology that's capable of removing the things causing the most harm. So
great, great, Stacy. And then I just want to wrap up today's session by saying we are so concerned about wildfire smoke and house fire smoke too, that we're putting together a course, an online course for consumers, lay people, doctors, everybody, on what to actually do if you're in the path of a wildfire or your house burns down. And we have an amazing course that tells you what to do step by step. When you burn a house, what's actually being released. And we have solutions and therapeutics, and we talk about supplements that can be helpful and the type of protective gear that you can wear and what's in the ash of the home. Do you really want to touch that? No, you really don't want to touch that. So we are coming up with that. And I'll just leave you with an overarching concept of when you're dealing with wildfire smoke is you are depleting your body of antioxidants. And so repletion of antioxidants like vitamin C and A and E are very important to be able to withstand the free radical attack of all of the particles and heavy metals and PAHs and everything in the smoke. Our course on wildfire smoke, what to do in a disaster, is going to be informational only. We will not be selling vitamins or supplements. We will also not be giving specific recommendations in terms of dosing, because we want you to work with your own providers on this, but we just wanted to have a resource available for everyone should they encounter a wildfire or a home fire. So that is on its way, and we will include that link when the course is finished. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Austin on the Air. For more information on air filtration, air quality, and respiratory health, visit austinair.com.